Hello everybody, this is Naya from DoSpace and welcome to the history of OS. Now this is a different format that I am doing, so bear with me and here we go. What exactly is the OS? The OS is one of the most popular mobile operating systems developed and created by Apple. What it is, it's an electronic gadget that runs on iOS. iOS devices include iPad, iPod Touch, and iPhone. iOS is the second most popular OS after Android. Over the years, Android and OS devices have been competing so much for a higher market share. And now let's go over the history. This is the one that started it all, which shipped pre-installed on the original iPhone. This version of the operating system wasn't called the iOS at the time of launch. From versions 1 to 3, Apple simply referred it as the Apple OS. Then its name shifted to iOS with 4. It's hard to convey to modern readers who have lived through the iPhone years how profound a breakthrough this version of the operating system was. Support for features like multi-touch screen, visual voicemail, and iTunes integration were significant advancements. While this was a breakthrough, it lacked many of the features that we all wanted, which would be in future versions, including native third-party apps. The apps at the time included Calendar, Photos, Camera, Notes, Safari, Mail, Phone, and iPod, with the key new features featuring visual voicemail, multi-touch interface, Safari browser, and the music app. The second version was released 1 year later, and it became a bigger hit than almost anybody could have realized. And this coincided with the release of the iPhone 3G. The most profound change included in the version that was the iStore, which was the App Store, and its support for native third-party applications. Around 500 apps were available at the App Store at the time of launch, and hundreds of other critical improvements was also included. Other important changes included in the 5 updates for 2 included podcast support and public transit and walking directions. With version 3, along with the release of the 3GS, it added features including copy and paste, spotlight, search, MMS support in the message app, and the ability to control videos using the camera app. Also notable about this version of the iOS is that it was the first to support the iPad. The first, with the iPad being released on 2010 and version 3.2 coming along with it. Now, many aspects, the modern iOS begun to take shape in the form of 4. These features that are now widely used debuted in various updates to this version, including FaceTime, multitasking, iBooks, organizing apps into folders, personal hotspot, AirPlay, and AirPrint. Another important change introduced with 4 was the name iOS itself. As noted, the iOS name was unveiled for this version, replacing the previously used iPhone OS name. This was also the first version of the iOS to drop support for any iOS devices. It was not compatible with the original iPhone or the first generation iPod Touch. Some versions that were technically compatible were not able to use all the features of this version. Apple responded to the growing trend of wirelessness and cloud computing in the next software update by including essential features and new platforms. Among those was iCloud, the ability to activate your iPhone wirelessly, whereas you would have to rely on a connection to your computer, and syncing with iTunes via Wi-Fi. The more features that are now central to the iOS experience debuted here, including iMessage and the Notification Center. With 5, Apple had dropped support for iPhone 3G, first gen, iPad, and second and third gen iPod Touch. Controversy was one of the dominant themes of 6. While it introduced the world to Siri, which, despite later being surpassed by competitors, was a truly revolutionary technology. What you see right now, Siri was the start of it. However, the driver of these problems was Apple's increasing competition with Google, whose Android smartphone was posing as a threat to the iPhone, where Google had supplied Maps and iPhone and YouTube apps already pre-installed with the iPhone. And however, in 6, this had changed. Apple introduced its own Maps, which was badly received due to bugs, bad directions, problems with certain features. And as a part of the effort to solve these problems, Apple CEO Tim Cook asked the head of the iOS department, Scott Forstall, to make a public apology. When he refused, Cook fired him, which I understand. And Forstall had been, before his firing, Forstall had been involved with the iPhone since before the first model. So this was a profound change. And for this version, no support was dropped, but 3GS, iPhone 4, and iPad 2 couldn't use all the features of 6. Like 6, 7 met similar resistance upon its release. Unlike the previous one, the cause of unhappiness among 7's users wasn't that things didn't work. Sadly, it was because things had changed, which is understandable as well. After the firing of Scott Forstall, iOS development was overseen by Johnny Ive, who was Apple's head of design, and who had previously worked only on the hardware. In this version of the iOS, Ive ushered in a major overhaul to the user interface, designed to make it look and feel more modern. While the design was indeed more modern, its small, thin fonts were hard to read for some users, and frequent animations caused motion sickness for others. The design of the current iOS is taken from the changes made in 7. After Apple made these improvements and users had become accustomed to the changes and the complaints subsided. For the key features that were introduced were Activation Lock, AirDrop, CarPlay, Control Center, and Touch iPad. Obviously, since the older models couldn't support this feature, they were dropped. Now for the next version, 8, it was a more consistent and stable operation. Its radical changes that were done on the last 2 were now in the past, and Apple focused once again on delivering the big major features. Among these was Apple Pay, and with 8.4 update, the Apple Music service, the Apple Music subscription service was started. There were also improvements to the iCloud format too, with with the addition of DropCloud like iCloud Drive, iCloud Photo Library, and iCloud Music Library. And support was dropped, and iPhone 4 support for this was dropped. For iOS 9, after a few years of major changes to both the interface and technical foundation of the iOS, many observers began to charge that the iOS was no longer stable, dependable, and solid as it once was. They suggested that Apple should focus more on the foundation of the OS before adding new features, and this was what the company did with 9. While it did add some new features, the release was generally aimed at solidifying the foundation of the OS for years to come. The major improvements were delivered in speed and responsiveness, stability, performance on older devices as well. 9 proved to be an important refocusing that laid the groundwork for bigger improvements delivered in 10 and 11. The ecosystem that Apple built around the iOS had long been referred to as a walled garden because it is a very pleasant place to be on the inside, but it's very hard to gain access to. This was reflected in many of the ways Apple locked down the interface of the iOS, the options to give it gave to apps. And cracks began to show in the walled garden in 10, and Apple put them there. The major themes of iOS 10 were interoperability and customization, whereas the apps could now communicate directly with each other on a device, allowing one app to use some features from another without opening the separate app. Siri became available to third-party apps in new ways, and there were even apps built into iMessage. Beyond that, users now had new ways to customize their experiences, from being able to delete built-in apps to new illustrations and effects to punctuate their text messages. And with this update, support for 4S, 5 Gen iPod Touch, iPad 2, and first generation iPad mini had dropped. The iOS was originally developed to run on the iPhone. However, since then it's been expanded to Touch and iPad, and in the future even to Apple Watch and Apple TV. 11 emphasized this shift from the iPhone to the iPad. 11 contained lots of improvements for the iPhone, but its major focus is turning the iPad Pro series models into a legitimate laptop replacement for some users. Now, they've already started doing this, and this is a good idea, but obviously it's a long way to go before we can fully get rid of the laptops. So there's still, it's a learning process. This is done throughout a series of changes designed to make the iOS run on iPad a lot more like a desktop operating system. These changes included all the new drag and drop support, split screen apps, and multiple workspaces, a file browser app, and support for notation and handwriting with the iPad Pencil, which debuted that year. And with that, support for 3C, 5C, 5, iPhone 5C, iPhone 5, iPad 4, and iPad 3 had dropped. The new features and improvements added in 12 wasn't as extensive or revolutionary as some of the previous updates. Instead, 12 focused more on making refinements to commonly used features and on adding wrinkles that could improve how people use their devices. Some of the key features of 12 included improvements to Siri, like Siri shortcuts, enhanced augmented reality with ArcKit 2, and give users and parents a way to monitor and control their device use with screen time. And now we are at the current version, which is 13. This is perhaps the biggest change that was introduced because the OS no longer runs on the iPad. Let me rephrase that. Perhaps the biggest change introduced in iOS 13 is that the OS no longer runs on the iPad. That's better. Before everybody freaked out. This was due to the release of the iPad OS, which began with version 13. So it had its own iOS. That's the new iOS dedicated to making the iPad a more useful productivity device and a potential laptop replacement, as I've stated earlier. It's based on 13 and had many of the same features, but also adds specific items. Beyond that, 13 shores up some core features, including apps launching faster, unlocking devices with Face ID faster, and overhauling pre-installed apps like Reminder, Notes, Safari, and Mail. Maybe the most obvious feature is the dark mode, but the changes range wider than that and further bolster the already strong OS. And due to the current update, of course, iPad support for it was dropped because it will be having its own iOS. The 6th generation iPod Touch, the iPhone 6 series, and the iPhone 5S support was dropped with this as well. And now for the future. When it was first introduced, the world didn't know that this would be the beginning of a whole new world. And we are just getting started. And that is my presentation on the history of iOS. For more information or a copy of the presentation, please go to dospace.org to get more information. Again, this is Naya from DoSpace, and have a nice day.